Okay, thank you very much. I've been asked to talk about the transformation of Melbourne's waterfront, which was the subject of a book that I completed about 10 years ago. So some of this it's a little bit history, but I'll try and bring it up to date as much as I can. Anyway, I'm going to run through this. I want to say first of all that I think of I'm an academic, so I'm not a practitioner. So I think of the role of an academic here as not so much to bring some idea of best practice in urban design, but rather to bring a critique of different kinds of practice to see what kind of lessons that we might learn from, in this case, a series of real projects. Melbourne, here we go. Is it not going to work? Okay. Melbourne, a very potted history. Melbourne's a colonial city that begins in the early 19th century with essentially a British invasion and the imposition of a colonial city into an Aboriginal landscape. This is one of the earliest depictions of it. It was always depicted as looking much more like England than in fact it does. It's relatively flat. But it's a city that is on the this is far up the Yarra River as one can come in a boat. There's fresh water above. That's why the city is where it is. And this is in many ways a story of over the centuries of the port moving downstream. First of all from the river here, which you can see is fairly marshy on the other side, down into Docklands here, which didn't exist at this time, and then ultimately further again. That's at the same scale, around about 30, 40 years later. The city has largely developed within the urban grid. The south side of the river is still undeveloped. The port is still this bit here, and that's where the Docklands are going to come. And then 1945, nearly 100 years later, both of those areas have developed as industrial areas that are soon to become obsolete. An industrial area on the south side of the river, and then a port has been excavated out of what was formerly marshland down here. None of this landscape is natural in any sense of the word. So this is, like all cities really, very much an imposed landscape. I'm going to very quickly run through with an overview of what these projects look like, and then I'll run through them one at a time. I don't really have time to get into very much detail here, and I'll end on some points of lessons that we might learn from this particular set of projects. This is around about 2000, which is when the Google Maps start. The South Bank area down here has one of the earlier projects, pretty much already developed. We've got a stadium developing in the Docklands. We're going through it 2 years per slide. We have Federation Square, a much celebrated project over here, probably the best of these projects. Some small projects emerging down in the Docklands. 2004, there's new projects, some film studios. A bank headquarters moves down here. A new housing development emerges over here. 2006, new project called Waterfront City over in the Docklands. 2008, an area called Batman's Hill is emerging in the Docklands. 2010, there is some new convention centre down here and with the exhibition areas. This has developed some more. 2012, 2014, and it's nowhere near really complete, if you like, but I don't think any city is ever going to be complete. But that's the Google Earth run-through to give you an overview. Now I'll give you a different kind of an overview, which is going to start from the left-hand side of this screen up here with the first project, which is Federation Square. So these are not necessarily in chronological order, but they enable me to bring up different issues and different processes and make some evaluations of them. We're going to run through, moving from left to right and ending on the Docklands. Federation Square was, as I said, one of the finest projects. The discussion in the previous session reminded me to mention that the Docklands was undertaken with a competition. It was a closed competition. There was a commitment from the government that they would build the result. There was no political interference. When the result came out, the Premier of the state, the politician in charge, was horrified. He said privately that it was rubbish and he didn't want to build it. A long, protracted process went on to try and educate him as to the merits of the design. Eventually it was built. Many people in Melbourne said it was rubbish. But over a long period of time, Melburnians have come to love it, and it's actually really a very successful project in a whole lot of ways that I really don't have time to tell you about here, but it's much published, including a chapter in the book, which is called Fluid City, from which all of this material comes. This is what it looked like before we started from the river. It was in front of a cathedral. Some people were objecting to the idea that a new building should be in the same visual field as a Christian cathedral. But Federation Square was intended to be an image of the nation, of a new nation, a multicultural nation. It was intended to transform the image of the city, indeed to rebrand the city, and that is one of its successes. That's what it looks like down the bottom. I imagine a lot of you have visited. I imagine that a lot of you know it a bit. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But that's how it sits in relation to that riverscape on the edge of the city. In many ways, this has become Melbourne's new big outdoor room. It has engendered not only a new image of the city, but also quite a lot of new activities in the city that didn't happen there before. There's a lot of things like outdoor dancing, and indeed it has become, I'm not sure if I have the relevant slides, it's become the place to celebrate on New Year's Eve, the place to celebrate great sporting events, and the place to engage in political protest. This was one of the largest, which was against our involvement in the war in Iraq. The second of these projects, there's going to be a few, is usually known as South Bank. It's this little stretch in here. It involves a whole series of publicly led. In this case, it wasn't a competition, it was a publicly led process. It actually happened before Federation Square. It was, there's some fairly interesting urban design work happened along the waterfront. A lot of different firms involved. In this case, one of the lessons was that the urban design was very well done. The architecture was actually quite poorly done in many ways. That the urban design of the pedestrian bridge, pedestrian bridge, and much of the waterfront was really high quality design. That's what it looked like, looking along some of that waterfront. It's an industrial waterfront. At the top there again, you've got, that's 1985, this is 1995 from the same spot, the pedestrian bridge. And it's a fairly bustling and lively waterfront most of the time. It's on the south side of the river, which of course for us means that it's always in the sun. You get a fantastic view of the city, and it fairly buzzes at night sometimes. There's a lot of different architects and designers. I won't start to talk about who they worked on various parts of this. The third project I'm going to talk about is the casino. This one is a much less successful project, indeed something of a disaster for Melbourne. A decision was made to give over about a half kilometre of the city waterfront to a single building, a casino, even though it was, there was an attempt to disguise the architecture by distributing the design to about 5 different firms as if that would somehow breed variety, which it never really did. But the biggest problem here was the sense in which a very large internal mall and gambling hall blocked off, I'm sorry, this is going ahead without my control, blocked off half a kilometre of waterfront so that there's no permeability back, and long term it has permanently blocked the future redevelopment of the areas to the south of the casino. In any case, if you want my critique of the casino, there's a lot of other dimensions to this critique as well, including the ways in which it was producing a new kind of urban spectacle and was, in my view, certainly not against, it was against the public interest. The next project is not so much a project as these are more precincts than projects, some of them. This is the Melbourne Exhibition Centre, very fine building, a very political building in a whole lot of ways, representing the new model of the corporate state, these blades taking off, and this is the convention centre. So there was a whole area down here that was part of a strategy to produce a kind of a global precinct of global exhibitions, hotels, conventions, and so on, and that seems to have been reasonably successful. It's not entirely clear just how. It's also connected vaguely to the casino. Not sure whether that connection actually works or what the synergies are there. And then the final project that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on is the Docklands, which is a huge area, 150 hectares of public land, which is, if I could go, there it is, to go back to this slide, it's actually a fairly swampy area at the end of the city that no one used for a long time until it was dredged out and became for a while, the largest port in the southern hemisphere. That's in the 1920s. There's quite a lot of docks lined with warehouses, and there they are again. I think that's a bit later. And the slides are slightly out of order. That's going back during the Second World War. It was home to the American fleet. It actually fits quite a lot of ships in there, at least under those conditions it did. Then we went to the point where we're trying to develop Docklands. This begins in the early 1990s, and this is a period when a particularly nasty streak of neoliberal ideology took over the state government, and planning was largely abandoned. These are some images from the planning documents that were produced at that time. This was the plan for Docklands. These indeed were the only plans that were being produced, with one exception, which I'll show you in a moment. You'll notice, though, that they're not what you'd normally call plans. They are sets of arrows and streaks and diagrams, and it's producing a kind of a collage of a wishful future where everyone is happy and prosperous, and but there is no real plan for the Docklands. This is the closest that we kind of got, which you'll notice is called a proactive context map, and in small print, not a master plan. So there was a kind of an ideology that took over the state, that the state was no longer responsible for planning, that planning was to be done by the market, and that the market would lead and that the government would follow. And this is the Docklands we find is the result of that process. It's not entirely a bad outcome, but it is mostly, in my view, fairly negative. This was in 1993. The plan, in as much as there was one, was to divide it into precincts and let the market answer a call for tenders. When the precincts were firmed up, they looked like this. They were up to 40 hectares in size, and so it's very, very large. Only very large developers were there. The strategy was to attract global capital. The idea was that capital was going to flow in from all over the globe, simply because this land was available for development in Melbourne, but it came with a premium that it had to be developed within 10 years. This was to be Melbourne's millennium mark. We're here only 4 years away from the millennium. There's nothing there except this old industrial landscape, this greyfield site. And it was to be developed in 10 years. And in order to do that, of course, the developers had to spread around whatever capital they could find. Let me go back for a second. Whatever capital they thought that they could raise and investment, and then spread it across that amount of land. And so we kind of got an underdevelopment of the site. But first of all, the developers were actually quite confused. This sort of abandonment of the state of any kind of urban design framework left developers saying, well, what happens on my precinct here if I don't know what's going to happen here or here, because that's going to change everything. Developers couldn't calculate their risks without understanding the context under which they would do that. The state's response was to come back and to hire some, not urban planners, but urban designers, the very well-known, very, very good professional firm, Ashton Reggett McDougall, to produce imagery, effectively, to produce a kind of fictional version of what Melbourne's Docklands might look like in the future. And this is what they came up with. And this was the state's version of a plan, if you like, at that point. Many people mistook it. Indeed, the best local newspaper mistook it for reality, when in fact it was all fiction. There's not a building here, not a road, not a height limit, nothing that was actually being proposed by the state. But it was a very seductive set of images, and a lot of people bought it, and a lot of people thought that the government was onto a good thing. Nonetheless, they put it out to tender. Let's see how I'm going for time. They put it out for tender, and different proposals came in, including one for the world's tallest building. I'll spare you that story. It does occupy an entire chapter. In the end, we got a set of projects, including a Ferris wheel, a shopping mall, quite a lot of high-rise apartment towers, and there's all kinds of things that were, in a sense, reasonably problematic about the outcomes. I'm going to run out of time if I don't flip through these fairly fast, because I want to end on a few points of conclusion. This is kind of what it looks like now. There's quite a lot of fairly good architecture down there, which, in a sense, in my mind, kind of camouflages some of the more difficult urban design decisions. You find a lot of fairly shady waterfronts which weren't protected from overshadowing, and you find a lot of fairly barren waterfronts where there's hardly anybody there, partly because an awful lot of the apartments are not occupied. And it's not that they're not yet occupied, they are deliberately not occupied, they're being kept empty. There's a kind of an emptiness, and now a widely conceived sense of kind of barrenness about much of Docklands, which is in stark contrast to the other great success story that I don't have time to talk to you about, which is the revitalisation of central Melbourne, which would be a different topic, but it's the contrast between what's gone right in central Melbourne and kind of what went wrong in Docklands that has left people with some of these questions. I'm going to run through very quickly what I've called 7 lessons that we might learn from these processes. The first of this is, and we didn't need to learn this, and we kind of got this right, continuous public access and control along the waterfront. We got public access, we didn't maintain public control in every case. The second one was to engage with the water. We got the setbacks in many parts here were much too large. Down on the river, they were quite smart. Down in Docklands, 30-metre setbacks were proved to be excessive and leave it looking fairly barren. Another one is that there's not much small grain. They were all, by dividing it into precincts and leaving it to very large developers, you tend to get large grain projects. So the kinds of bottom-up placemaking, I don't really mind you using that word, the kind of bottom-up placemaking that so many of us are so keen on has found it difficult to find a foothold there. Another lesson was that a lot of these processes got hooked into the production of political capital for local politicians who are engaged with 3 or 4-year election cycles, and that when urban design gets hooked into that, it becomes dumbed down, it becomes speeded up much too fast, and it becomes subject to being controlled by the political process. Competitions are one way of keeping that out of the political process. Certainly worked for Federation Square. Another one was that sort of covered that issue as well, about taking the long view. And the last one was about capturing the capital gains. We're not good at doing this. There was a sense in which this is the central pier of the main harbour at Docklands, and the redevelopment of the central part of that is still there. It's still as a kind of question mark, and we can't figure out how to fund it. And of course, we could have funded it out of the capital gains. If we'd done something really beautiful and dramatic there, then we could have captured the capital gains that would produce, and we didn't do that. And the last one, don't believe the hype. It was unbelievable just how much hype there was, how great the future was going to be, particularly in Docklands. There's always a lot of hype with these large urban design projects. I think the issue is to look hard through these and try and be critical about what works in urban design and what doesn't. And that's the book that you might want to read if you want to hear any more about this. Thank you very much.